Let's get started. Welcoming Reverend Dr. Deanna Womack back. This is her latest book. It will be in the library once she finishes writing a little excerpt inside it. So those of you that took a copy last week and read it, you know what a great writer she is. So, as a former professor, I complimented her on that because that was one of my downfalls when I was teaching. So, Deanna, without any further ado, let's go to the next week.
Thank you so much, Rick. And it's a pleasure to see you all again this morning. Great to be here. So our topic for the second session is Christian life in the Islamic Middle East. Last week we started at least introducing Middle Eastern Christians, and today I'll give you some reminders and a little bit more information about those different Middle Eastern Christian church families and denominations. So if you weren't here last week, don't worry, you'll get a little recap. And if it felt like a lot of information last week, then we'll reinforce that this time. There was an optional reading from one of my earlier books called Neighbors. And if you didn't get that and you're still interested, I'll leave it here and you can grab one. There are still copies. And then anybody who wasn't here last week who would like the Middle East Church chart and the map. And next week will be our final session, and we'll be moving. We've been moving sort of chronologically, historically. We'll get into the 20th and 21st century next week and talk a little bit about Christianity and the way that geopolitics in the Middle East have influenced what Christian life is like there up to the present. But we're going to start again back in the ancient Near East and ask ourselves the question: how did we get to this map, our map of today? Where the Middle East is a number of nation states, the languages and kind of the dominant ethnic groups and languages are Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and so you can kind of see those regions shaded on your map. And then a few things you should know. This is a recap from last time, that the religious, cultural, and linguistic diversity of the ancient Near East and the modern Middle East is really extensive and often much more rich than many of us have encountered or recognized. There's a long history of power passing from empire to empire, and so what's life like for the people on the ground, whether they're Christian or from another religious tradition, it depends on who's, partly on who is in power. And then the shift to nations has been relatively recent. That's just in the 20th century, following the First World War. And even then, there are colonial imperial powers that have been influencing the Middle East. So this map of what we see today, this map of what we see today is really relatively recent in the long scope of Middle Eastern Christianity. So here's an earlier map of the ancient Near East, around the year 620, and this is, after. It's a time when the early church is kind of solidifying into its liturgical practices and its traditions and its divisions. And so the two main powers that are kind of defining what life is like are the Byzantine Empire, which becomes a Christian empire, and the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire, which is Zoroastrian at the time. And you don't need to look into all of the details, but if you did, you would see that the border between these two imperial powers is constantly shifting, and that things change for the people who are living along those borders that are shifting. So as a reminder, the Sasanian Persian Empire, that's roughly where Iran is today. It was a little bit bigger than that, but that's the Persian culture. Zoroastrianism was the imperial religion, and what Middle Eastern Christian communities lived in this eastern part of the ancient Near East, the Assyrian Church of the East especially. So that's part of the Syriac tradition. That's the language that they use, or they spoke it and that's the language that became their liturgical language and still is. Also, a lot of Armenian apostolic churches and communities there in the eastern part of the Middle East. Then in the Byzantine Empire, which when it becomes Christian, it's the Eastern Roman Empire. This is really where all the action in terms of early Christianity is happening in the Byzantine Empire. That's roughly Turkey and the Arab Middle East and North Africa today. And the communities that were Christian communities in that region, the imperial religion is the Eastern Orthodox Church, or what becomes what we know as the Eastern Orthodox Church today. And those communities spoke both Greek and Syriac. Their liturgies were in both Greek and Syriac for a while, and then became basically Greek because that was the imperial language. So you have an imperial religion, that's Christianity, and then you have other diverse Christian communities who are not part of the imperial religion and are often treated as such. That would include the Maronites, which is a Syriac tradition, the Syriac Orthodox Church, another Syriac tradition, Coptic Orthodox in Egypt, and the Armenian Apostolic churches, which are also in the Byzantine Empire. So just a little snapshot of what things looked like at that time. Here's a reminder, and it's on the other side of your Middle East map, of the 5 Middle Eastern church families. So we have the Eastern Orthodox, which we know now was the imperial religion of the Byzantine Empire. We have the Catholic family. We have the Church of the East, that's the Assyrian church that was in the Sasanian Empire, mostly the Persian Empire. We have the Oriental Orthodox, that includes the Copts, the Syriac, and the Armenian Apostolic churches. And then much later, a number of new Catholic churches with roots in those ancient communities, and Protestants who started in the 19th century. But in terms of who was in existence back at this point, when we have a division between the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires, it's fewer. These are the churches that are tracing their roots to the early centuries of Christianity under Byzantine or Sasanian rule. So in terms of those who would identify as Catholic today, the Maronites were there, although their connection with Rome was not the same at that time. The Church of the East, as we've mentioned, the Eastern Orthodox, and then the 3 Oriental Orthodox churches. And then just to get us moving closer to present, the Sasanian Empire fell to the Arab Muslim Caliphate. It made a capital in Baghdad in 651. So this is shortly after that map that I showed you. And then a little bit later on, there's another important Persian empire that defines life for some of the Christians living under it, especially Assyrians as well as Armenians. And that's the Safavid Persian Shia Muslim Empire. So the 2 largest branches of Islam are Sunni and Shia. It's not an intro to Islam today, so you don't need to know the differences, but just to know that was the Shia Persian Empire's culture from 1501 to 1736. And then on the other side, the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. That capital was Constantinople. It became more widely known as Istanbul, which is a very similar term, just in Turkish. And that empire, the Ottoman Empire, lasted until 1924, or that was the end of the Ottoman Caliphate. So I've mentioned the term caliphate twice, and that leads us more into our topic for today, which is Christian life under Middle Eastern, in the Middle East under Islam. And so here's a really brief history of Islam and Muslim caliphates, which also equated to Muslim empires. So the life of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia was from 570 to 632. After his death in 632, there was a period of rule that he had 4 successors. They were known in Arabic as caliphs, which really means political successor to Muhammad. So they're not prophets, they're not religious leaders, but they're political leaders trying to also carry out the religious vision of Islam. And so there were 4 of them centered in the capital of Medina, which is in Saudi Arabia today. And then there are a number of other caliphates, which just means that these political entities consider themselves to be the successor of the Prophet Muhammad in terms of his political governing capacity over the Islamic community. And so by the time you get to the Umayyads, and this is just a family name, so it becomes a dynasty. They established their capital in Damascus, that's in Syria, and this is the Umayyad Empire, so it's an empire. And I think I might have the dates wrong. The 661 is not correct. It goes later because they are taken over by the Abbasid Caliphate in 750, and their center is in Baghdad. When the Mongols come in 1258, they uproot the caliphate, but it survives as it migrates to Cairo, so it lasts a little bit longer in Egypt. And then in terms of what the political region looks like, after that, the Ottoman Empire comes and it takes control not only of the Byzantine Christian Empire, which had shrunk down to mostly what present-day Turkey is, but all of what we know as the Arab Middle East comes under the Ottomans. And so there are Turkish-speaking parts of the Ottoman Empire, but there are also Arabic-speaking parts of the empire. So what you should know about this history, the Arab Islamic Empire, which are Sunni caliphates, that's the larger branch of Islam, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad until 1517, never included Constantinople, but it shared a border with the Byzantine Empire. During the Abbasid conquest, so that's the second major Arab Muslim empire, the Byzantine territory shrank, as I was saying, roughly to modern Turkey, as well as other parts of southeastern Europe. That's by 850, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then this is not just to show you this is not just a Christian-Muslim sort of border rivalry. You have Mongols who eventually convert to Islam, you have Turkic people who are Muslim, and you have Persian Muslims, and all of these later are taking territory from the Abbasid Sunni Muslims. So these are empires that are fighting for power, and some of them happen to be Muslim, some of them happen to be Christian. So this is what the Islamic conquest looks like from the 7th to 9th century, just to show the darker areas are where it begins, the lighter areas are where it expands, and this is mostly under the Abbasid Empire in Baghdad. And just remember that name is going to be important for also understanding what life was like for Middle Eastern Christians under that empire. But one really interesting and important thing I think that we need to note if we're asking ourselves what is life like for Christians living under these Arab Islamic empires, it's that for non-Byzantine Christian groups in the Levant, so the Arabic-speaking part of the Middle East and Mediterranean, life under the Arab Islamic Empire often meant less religious persecution. And that's because the Eastern Orthodox churches and those that follow them, this is imperial Byzantine Christianity, and that's the Christianity that the emperor wanted to spread everywhere under his control. And so these other churches that are not part of this strain are very much persecuted. And so again, this isn't an issue of Christian-Muslim persecution, it's an issue of imperial religion wanting to impose itself, not just to make everyone Christian, but to make everyone a certain kind of Christian. And so for many of these other churches and Christian communities, life is a little bit more relaxed when they come under the Arab Islamic rule. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, but they had religious autonomy, and so their particular theology wasn't a source of debate and actual conflict and violence. So just as a reminder, the thing that distinguished imperial Byzantine Christianity from the others is the question of Christology, or how do we understand Jesus Christ as being both divine and human? And these are things that people fought and died over. So the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine religion, and then also is the same strain where Catholic and Protestants get our understanding of Christ as being one person in two natures. That's the imperial religion, but those who had a slightly different understanding of that Christology are the ones that become persecuted. So theology really matters at this time. It's a matter of life and death. But once you fall under a different religious ruler, under the Arab Islamic Empire, they don't care quite so much about these Christian theological distinctions, and so there's more actual openness to have slightly different theologies. So a few more things that you should know. Under Islamic empires, Christians and Jews as well were protected people of the book. They were known to be people of the book. And because the caliphs or the successors to the Prophet Muhammad looked to the Quran for guidance on how to lead, the Arab Islamic empires in the Middle East considered Jews and Christians protected people. They were called people of the book because they were communities whose scriptures, whose books, whose holy books, the Muslims honored. So due to this Islamic foundation for the treatment of non-Muslims, from the beginning of Islam to the end of the Ottoman Empire, Christians and Jews did not experience persistent religious persecution. Of course it happened when you have religious differences. Persecution seems to always rear its face in some cases, but it wasn't persistent, it wasn't massive. Yet Muslim armies did take control of the Middle East long before modern conceptions of citizenship and equality were the norm. And Jews and Christians were subject peoples, just like the regular Muslim people on the ground were subject peoples to the empires. So Christians were not forced to convert, but they were subordinate in social status to Muslims in most times and places. It's hard for an empire to enforce its policies everywhere and in all cases. And they were subject to certain legal restrictions. So as I said, it's hard for an empire to apply its rules everywhere, and these rules were not strictly or uniformly applied. But they did allow imperial officials to distinguish between subjects and to preserve Islamic religious traditions. And that was important in the early years of Islam because it wasn't the majority religion at that time. So there was a possibility that as the Islamic empires expanded, that they would actually absorb the culture and religion of the people that they were conquering, and then they would lose that religious tradition that was important to them. And also some of these sort of impositions or legal restrictions they didn't originate with Islam, but they were actually political practices of past empires, like the Sasanian Persians. So Islam as a religious entity did not introduce such social restrictions or persecutions. And in fact, non-Muslims are not bound by Islamic religious law or Sharia, if you've heard of Islamic law. The Jews and the Christians in the Middle East were political subjects of Muslim rulers, but each faith community adjudicated its own matters of religious law, so it had its own religious courts. Now, despite this religious autonomy, there were certain social and political advantages to being or becoming Muslim. So for example, Muslims had a lower tax burden. They often found more professional opportunities, even though they may have had their own grievances over imperial policies. Another interesting thing to note is that the conditions of many Jewish communities improved as rule shifted from Christian Byzantium to the Islamic empires. For the same reason that those non-imperial Byzantine Christian communities, situations generally tended to improve under Islamic empires. But the disadvantages of being non-Muslim made conversion to Islam attractive for some Christians, especially those who had perhaps enjoyed privileges under Byzantine rule. We can imagine other non-material reasons for conversion as well. Perhaps some Christians came to appreciate Islamic spiritual teachings. Perhaps they became acclimated to the ruling culture as they took on Arabic as a spoken language. Or perhaps they never liked Byzantine Christian practices in the first place. So the question of what the people on the ground are doing and why, it's hard to know when we go back so many centuries. But there are many reasons why the Middle Eastern Christians began to convert to Islam. So for various reasons that usually not due to conversion by the sword, Christianity began to disappear in some parts of North Africa, like Tunisia, for example, which was important for the early church, but really doesn't have a Christian presence today. Yet even as the Muslim population grew through conversion, other Christian communities persisted, and so their stories are ones that we can really learn from in terms of what Christian life is like under Islamic rule. So continuing with the next 2 points on the slide, there's gradual Arabization of the region that we know today as the Arab world. So if you look at your map, those places that are Arabic speaking, roughly, with Christians adopting Arabic as their language, their spoken language, and gradually also the language in some of their churches, and larger numbers converting to Islam. So I wanted to ask you all, as you look at your chart, if you have it, or look up here, and if you want another chart, I can pass it around. Which groups do you think are Arabs or Arabic speakers in terms of the five families and the different branches? So I'll invite you just to take a minute to look at the chart and then share your response with a neighbor. And if you'd like another copy of your chart, even though if you had one last week, we have one too. Anybody else want to? Pass that down. Okay, let's hear some of your responses as you're consulting with your neighbors. Which churches do you think are Arab churches or Arabic speaking or become Arabic speaking churches?
Well, I thought you said that Syriac was the language that those churches spoke. Therefore, the Arabic ones would be the non-Syriac. Okay, so that would be the Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, Eastern Orthodox. Yes, and particularly, I'll point out in a moment which particular churches are. Yeah, so Eastern Orthodox. You're right to look at. So the ones that say have a specific language here. Most of these are not Arabic speakers today. Any other?
Probably some of the Protestant ones.
Yeah, for sure. Many of the Protestant ones. So, and let me go through. Actually, most. I would say all of the Protestants except for the churches in Iran. Yeah, even usually in Sudan. Maybe there are some in Sudan who are not Arabic and some who are. But yeah, everybody else today. Oh, and the Armenians, the Iranians, which are mostly either Persian speakers or Assyrian. And maybe some in Sudan who are African and not of Arab heritage, but everyone else is Arab. Any final thought or insight on this? I'm going to walk you through each tradition just to clarify, because there's one exception to this rule about the Syriac tradition. And so I'll show you that one first. So Middle Eastern churches, those that we would consider Arabs or are native Arabic speakers today. And so the one exception within the Syriac tradition that still uses the Western form of Syriac in its liturgy is the Maronite church. So their vernacular today is Arabic. If you look at the map and you see where most Maronites live in Lebanon, a minority are in Syria, that is the place that kind of embraced Arab language and culture and civilization most. And so the Maronite community, although it retained the ancient Syriac for its church services, its vernacular everyday language became Arabic. Now today, if you ask Maronites specifically if they're Arabs, they might say, we're Lebanese. This is really, it's an important part of the religious landscape in Lebanon. Here's Pope Leo visiting one of the most famous Lebanese saints. But Lebanese also are Arabic speakers. They're very much part of Arab culture, and their participation in Arab culture has really shaped who they are today. So that's the one exception in terms of the Syriac traditions. So others that are Arabs or that speak Arabic today, Coptic Orthodox. So this is almost exclusively in Egypt. Now, if you ask, so they speak Arabic. Ancient Coptic is not a spoken language today, but it is important in the liturgies of Coptic Orthodox churches. But just like the Lebanese, if you ask Copts today, but particularly Copts in the U.S., they might say we're Egyptian. Coptic means Egyptian, and that we speak Arabic, or in Egypt, the community speaks Arabic, but we're not Arabs. So they may say that they're not Arabs. If you ask others, an earlier generation or people in Egypt, where kind of the national unity was really important between Christians and Muslims, they'll tell you they are Arabs. So, so I try to distinguish Arabic speakers and try to listen to Middle Eastern Christian conversation partners in terms of the way they define themselves. But they're part of the Arabic-speaking world, for sure. So here's the cathedral in Cairo, one of the oldest Coptic churches in Cairo that I showed you last week. And then the Coptic Catholic Church, that came out of the Coptic Orthodox Church, same in terms of their liturgy as being ancient Coptic and their today's vernacular as being Arabic. And they're also in Egypt. Here's their cathedral in Cairo. So everyone else, if you ask them, they would most definitively tell you that they are Arabs and Arabic speakers. So Eastern Orthodox, which was identified as being one of the main churches where the community is Arabic, that is the patriarchates of Antioch in Syria, in Alexandria, which is in Egypt, but those are mostly Arabs from the Levant, and in Jerusalem, Palestinians. Those are the Arabs and the Arabic speakers within the Eastern Orthodox Middle Eastern family. Others in Cyprus or Istanbul would be Greek speakers and would be ethnic Greeks. But in terms of, in the Arab Middle East, these are Syrians, they're Palestinians, Lebanese, and Jordanians who are part of Eastern Orthodox Arabic-speaking churches. Here's their cathedral in Syria. The Melkite Catholic Church is the Catholic church that came out of the Eastern Orthodox Church, so they basically have the same sort of demographic. Their liturgy might be in Greek, but actually today most of their liturgy is in Arabic, but they're vernacular, and it's because their vernacular is in Arabic, and those are Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, and Jordanians. Here's their cathedral or their basilica in Lebanon. I think it's one of the most beautiful churches with the Eastern architecture. And then Protestants. So not all Protestants, but we noted on the map the number of Arabic-speaking Protestants in the Middle East. So Coptic churches, as well as the first. Here's the first Arab Protestant church in Beirut, Lebanon. So Lebanese Protestants as well. You have Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, Jordanian, Egyptian, and then all across North Africa, in places where there wasn't for a long time an indigenous Arabic-speaking Christian community. Muslims who converted to Protestantism formed some of those communities, like places like Algeria or Tunisia. One of the biggest Coptic Presbyterian or evangelical churches in Egypt here. Okay, so any questions about this? A little bit of a recap in terms of who the Middle Eastern Christians are, and I've given you a little bit of information about their lives under their early Islamic empires, the Arab Islamic caliphates. Any burning questions before we move?
Just what do you consider to be the liturgical language of the modern day Roman Catholic Church?
So I mean, it's vernacular. Since Vatican II, it's the vernacular.
All right, so
except for a few of those conservative Catholic churches that have retained Latin, but that's kind of the official is that it's wherever you go, it's the language of it's the language of the people.
So that's not true of these churches that you mentioned. I mean, so their liturgical language is what you put there. They're not their Bible, so to speak. We're talking Christians. Their Bible is that, for lack of a better term, the ancient language rather than.
So their Bibles will be Arabic or whatever language they speak. Let me give you the example of the Maronite Catholic Church. So as I said, the Lebanese are an Arabic-speaking people. The majority of their liturgy, so what happens in the service in Lebanon, is going to be in Arabic, but certain parts always include the Syriac or the Aramaic, because that's their ancient tradition that they want to keep. And so there'll be certain chants or hymns, and then always in the celebration of the Mass or communion, the words of institution are in Aramaic. And so, but for example, if you go to a Maronite church in Atlanta, St. Joseph's, it will be in English, and then those parts that are always in Syriac will be in Syriac. If you go to the Maronite churches in Mexico that I visited, everything is going to be in Spanish except for some of those hymns and the words like in the communion. So that's following the Catholic sort of vernacularization, that you put the service in the language of the people, but it's also retaining the ancient language, which which you don't see so much in, I mean, you might have a hymn in a Catholic church, Roman Catholic church, or even in a Presbyterian church that's in Latin, that kind of, preserves that ancient heritage. But it's a little bit different, I think, for the Maronites because they self-identify as being ethnically, like their ethnic and cultural roots are in the Syriac community. And so that's, I think, partly why retaining those ancient languages is important. And that's what makes them distinct from a distinct Catholic rite, an Eastern rite, and not part of Roman Catholicism.
Deanna, just a question, a clarification question. When you say Syriac, you're meaning Aramaic language?
Yes.
It's the same thing?
Yeah, so Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. And so Maronites, when they hear that in their services, they'll tell me, this is the language of Jesus. Jesus spoke Aramaic. There are different dialects, and so each church's liturgy is slightly different because of the region that they were in. And then those communities that still speak Syriac or Aramaic today, they have slightly different dialects. But so if you hear Syriac, you should think Aramaic, but in terms of like the classical language, usually Syriac is used.
Well, in Syriac is Syrian, the Syrian people spoke Syriac and Aramaic, is it?
Yeah, so that's the origin of the word. Of course, it's not in English. Today it's a little bit confusing because Syrian means people from the country of Syria. And the Syriac Orthodox Church, its patriarch is in Damascus. So it has that root. It's really Antioch that they trace their lineage to. But today, and in terms of how scholars talk about these communities, we use the term Syriac because it talks about the language group. It's also an ethnic group for some of these communities, and I'll go through those communities in a moment. But so, for example, if you hear someone say Syrian Orthodox Church, you don't know if that means the Aramaic Orthodox Church, which is in the Oriental Orthodox family, or if it means the Eastern Orthodox, the Arabic-speaking Orthodox that are part of the same community as the Greek Orthodox. And so, by saying Syriac, it helps to distinguish between what would all. It's probably already confusing, but it would be even more confusing.
So to follow up on her question, what is the vernacular language in Syria?
And so in Syria today, the vernacular language is Arabic. Yeah. And I want to give you a little bit more information about Christian life in the Arabic-speaking Islamic Middle East, and then I'll look at those churches that are not Arab and not Arabic-speaking, so you have a better idea of where they exist and who they are. So Christian life in the Islamic Middle East. So in the chapter that you might have read, or if you'd like to read it later, there's some copies here. I asked two questions. What historical knowledge would help orient American views of Christian-Muslim relations? So this book is really about informing American Christians. And then what can we learn from Arab Christians specifically, from their histories and their experiences living with Muslims? And so with regard to the political status of non-Muslims in the Middle East, we might note the following. Middle Eastern Christians were not routinely subject to anti-Christian violence. Due to political conquest, they were subject to legal restrictions that did not apply to Muslims. Christians actively participated in Islamic civilization and held autonomy over their own religious affairs. Muslim political leaders instituted these generally tolerant practices based on the Quran's openness to Christians and Jews being followers of the one God. So these statements challenge the notion that Muslims are against Christians generally, or that Muslim Christian history centers on conflict. Further, the final point indicates that the religious teachings of Islam actually help to temper the sort of power that emperors usually felt that they could exert over their subjects. So we can affirm this interreligious openness as innate to the Islamic tradition without claiming that relations between Muslims and Christians everywhere were always positive. To gain a fuller understanding of Christian life in the Middle East, we can also look beyond Islamic state policies to ask what relationships were like for individual Christians and Muslims who interacted on personal or professional spheres. So you need to imagine a truly interreligious society where where Christians and Muslims are whatever social status they are, they're interacting with Muslim neighbors. You could look at lower class peasant communities, for example, across the Middle East and find that the common concerns cut across all religions lines. So religion is not so important when you just need to feed your family, you need to pay your taxes, you need to learn how to survive, right? They're all kind of living the same sorts of lives trying to survive. But also opportunities for meaningful collaboration arose more frequently, as you might expect among the elite. And they were facilitated by established norms that invited Jews as well as Christians to contribute to Islamic society. Because even a few negative images can quickly overshadow the good, such positive examples of interreligious engagement I think are really important for us to identify and to remember. And so with that, I wanted to highlight two such examples of collaboration in the Arab Islamic Middle East from two different time periods. So the first one happens in Abbasid Baghdad. Remember, this is the Arab Islamic Empire that really expanded, but Baghdad is actually its capital until the Mongols come. And this is actually the time of the Islamic Golden Age, and it's something that Christians contributed to, so roughly from the 8th century to the 13th century. In the period of flourishing Arab Islamic civilization, at this time, Christians in Baghdad were among the scholars whom the Abbasid caliphs, or the successors of Muhammad, the rulers of this Islamic dynasty, these caliphs commissioned them to translate Greek thought into Arabic. One Christian translator, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who died in 873, was a philosopher and a chief physician to the caliph. He oversaw the work of translators at the famous House of Wisdom, a library in Baghdad founded by an earlier caliph. So you're seeing the engagement of, at the very top political level, inviting Christians who are well educated and who, partly because of their liturgies and the Christian past, know Greek, they know Syriac, and they know Arabic, and they're able to translate things. So Hunayn, for example, this is a later edition of a medical text that he wrote about the eye. So you can see kind of the scholarship that's coming out of this period. About a century later, another prominent Christian philosopher, Yahya ibn Adi, composed Arabic philosophical treatises promoting a public realm of open interreligious dialogue. Recognizing the divine power in all people, this is what he wrote. Men are a single tribe, related to one another. Humanity unites them. Both of these Christians in Baghdad were members of Syriac churches, but they spoke Arabic as well because of the Arabization. And such Christian intellectuals made ancient Greek wisdom and scientific texts accessible in Arabic, and they also contributed their own ideas about the human mind and philosophical life. This, in turn, spurred the work of Muslim intellectuals in what is known as the Golden Age of medieval Islamic civilization. So, important Christian contributions to this Arab Islamic society. Now we're going to turn to the Ottoman Empire and specifically Syria, what's Syria and Lebanon today. So later on, during the Ottoman Empire, which you see depicted here kind of at its height in the 17th century, the 19th century, so we're going to the 19th century now. The 19th century Arab Renaissance in Syria bore such a resemblance to this intellectual exchange in Abbasid Baghdad, in medieval Baghdad, that modern Syrian Arabs likened themselves to their Abbasid Muslim predecessors. They claimed this golden age as part of their own history, even though they were Christians. The Ottoman Empire, which took Constantinople and, as we remember, ended the Byzantine Christian Empire in 1453, lasted until World War I. It was officially abolished when the Republic of Turkey was established in 1924. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire, so super diverse and across 3 different continents. And it ruled over Muslims also of a variety of backgrounds as well, and a diversity of Christians. So all of these Christian communities that you see on your chart, all of them have at one time lived under the Ottoman Empire. So many of the Ottoman Arab Renaissance pioneers in Syria, interestingly enough, were actually Arab Christians who had become Protestant through contact with missionaries. So Presbyterians and Congregationalists were the ones that went to Syria and Lebanon. These Arab Protestants drew inspiration from the Arab Islamic past as they published scientific books and poetry. They founded new Arabic presses and schools, and gave lectures promoting modern thought. This is something I wrote about in my very first book, which came from my PhD dissertation. And along with other Christian, Muslim, and Jewish intellectuals, Protestant men and women envisioned their lives together in a modern Syrian homeland, so an interreligious connection within a shared homeland. So I wanted to highlight some of the women who were involved in this movement of Arab Renaissance, because prejudices about the Middle East and Islamic world might lead us to believe that women in the late 19th century couldn't have been very involved in these sorts of intellectual movements. But they were. So among the women authors in Syria was the pioneering Muslim feminist named Zainab Fawaz. She gained fame for publishing the first biographical dictionary of Arab women, which was titled Scattered Pearls. And Zainab invited her Protestant friend, Hannah Qurani, who was an author, and the Jewish journalist Esther Mouyal to contribute to the book. So these are all Syrian Arab women living around the area of Beirut. Arabic speakers, all of them, but of different religious traditions. So Zainab, the Muslim, reportedly also sent a copy of her book with the Syrian delegation that came to the United States for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Qurani and Mouyal, so Hannah and Esther, nice biblical names, the Protestant and the Jewish woman, both came to Chicago as well to attend the World's Fair. And back in Beirut, both were members of the first Syrian Women's Association. And meanwhile, Hannah and Zainab engaged in lively debates over the role of women in modern society. And it might surprise you to learn that the Protestant Hannah objected to the Muslim Zainab's vision of women as being able to hold the same positions in public society as men. So she was far more progressive in terms of women's rights and abilities than her counterpart, Hannah. And I think it was partly because of her understanding of Islam. And Hannah, informed by nice conservative Presbyterian missionaries, had a different view of what a woman's role was in the late 19th century. But along with the writings of Syrian Protestants who affirmed their own Islamic and cultural heritage during the Arab Renaissance, the stories of these women provide a glimpse into the interreligious Arab exchanges of the 19th century Ottoman Empire. I think they teach us to question presumptions that we might have about women in Islamic society, but also to dispel the myth that tensions between Christians and Muslims in the Middle East or anywhere else are innate. And more broadly as well between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. So it's not religion. In the experience of Middle Eastern Christians, it's not religion that is always causing the conflict. There are many more layers of politics that are bringing this about. And so here now I wanted to switch to shift from the talking mainly about Arab Christians to other Middle Eastern Christians who are non-Arabs. And just to note the common ties of Arab ethnicity in the stories that I've been sharing, Arab culture, Arabic language also facilitated these Christian-Muslim experiences of collaboration. So if you share a culture, you share a worldview, you're living right alongside neighbors who are basically the same as you, except they go to a mosque on Friday and you go to a church on Sunday. There's a lot of common ground to build on, right? But for other communities who have ethnic and linguistic differences, sometimes these things have compounded the religious differences. And at times of tension, those who are different can easily be exploited by the powers that be. And so I think this is a pattern in human history. We unfortunately see it today. We saw it also in the Ottoman Empire, particularly towards some Middle Eastern Christians who weren't Arabs. And most notably, so this wasn't the case at all times and all places, but most notably in the late 19th century, Ottoman massacres against Armenians that seemed to be condoned by the Ottoman Sultan even, or his, the government, as well as the genocides of World War I against Armenians, as well as members of the Syriac communities. So I wanted then to share with you, to reiterate which churches are not Arab churches and that Middle Eastern Christians belong to. So the Syriac Orthodox is one. So we would try to say Syriac Orthodox instead of Syrian. So we know that their ecclesial center is in Damascus, Syria. But they may be living in Syria, Iraq, or Turkey, and they're not Arabs. They do speak Arabic because they're probably living in Arab societies, but that's not their home language. That's not their language in their, their mother tongue that's spoken at home. They speak versions of Aramaic, a dialect of modern Aramaic. So there are still people today in these communities that are speaking the language of Jesus in their families. And then their ethnicity would be Syriac. Here's the Syriac Orthodox Cathedral in Damascus. The Syriac Catholics that came out of the Syriac Orthodox Church, similar. They're located in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Lebanon, importantly, because that's where their center, their ecclesial center, church center is. They speak Aramaic, and their ethnicity is Syriac. Here's the inside of the cathedral in Beirut. The Armenian Orthodox, not Arabic, they might be Arabic speakers, especially if they live in Lebanon or Syria, but their ethnicity and language is Armenian. There are also significant Armenian communities in Israel and Palestine, Iran and Turkey. So in terms of the breadth of the Armenian community, it's all across the Turkish, Arab, and Persian or Persian-speaking Middle East. Here's their cathedral in Lebanon. So one of the Armenian jurisdictions is in Lebanon, and that's because of the history of the genocides and the way that Armenians migrated out of Western Armenia or Eastern Turkey into Syria and Lebanon, escaping the genocides. And then the other ecclesial center is in the country of Armenia today. So there are two, but a really important one in the Middle East. Similar story for Catholics. Their cathedral is in Beirut. Armenian Catholics, they speak Armenian, their ethnicity is Armenian. And here's their cathedral, also in Lebanon. And then the Church of the East, so today called the Assyrian Church. Their liturgy is Syriac. Their vernacular, they might tell you that they speak Assyrian. They might identify themselves ethnically as being Assyrian, but their vernacular is also a dialect of modern Aramaic. And they're located in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Lebanon, and Jordan. Here are the two different patriarchs. There are two branches now within the Assyrian Christian community. The Chaldean Catholic Church came out of the Assyrian Church of the East, so they have a very similar background and experience, but they chose the name Chaldean for a different ancient empire. So they might tell you they speak Chaldean, but it's modern Aramaic, a very similar dialect to what Assyrians are speaking. They might tell you that ethnically they're Chaldean, or they're Assyro-Chaldean. And so, there's not one unifying sort of self-identification within that particular community. And there's their cathedral in Iraq. And then there are Protestants in the Middle East who are not Arabs as well, and so there would be people that are speaking Armenian or Syriac or Persian in Lebanon and Syria, in Israel and Palestine, Iran and Turkey. And just noting, one of the first Protestant church in the Middle East was not an Arabic-speaking church, and it was not in the Arab world. This was the Armenian Evangelical Church in Istanbul. So those are the non-Arab communities in the Middle East. And the last thing I wanted to close with was to get deeper into the story of one of these non-Arab Christian communities. I wanted to look at Assyrian Christians of the Church of the East, the ancient church of Persia, and their migration story. So here's the map again. The Church of the East developed. Oh, and so I would encourage you to listen, as you listen to this short story, to note their experiences, both positive and negative, under Islamic governments, but also the various other imperial powers that have really shaped this particular church's story. So the Church of the East developed east of the Byzantine Empire in Mesopotamia, which is present-day Iraq, and Persia, which is present-day Iran. Traditions of missionary movement are important within the church's liturgical life and practices. So for example, it observes the 3-day fast of Nineveh before the great fast of Lent in remembrance of the biblical prophet Jonah's missionary journey to residents of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. So isn't that interesting? We don't tend to think about Jonah as being part of our liturgical celebrations, but it's important for this church. Additionally, their origins are attributed to the missionary efforts of the Apostle Thomas, who sent Thaddeus to Edessa, a city in contemporary Turkey that was the capital of an ancient kingdom called Osrhoene. So So there, according to tradition, Thaddeus healed the king and established the church along with his disciple, Saint Maury. Continuing in this tradition, the Church of the East sent missionaries to India and China between the 3rd and the 13th centuries. So sometimes we think that the history of Christian missions really started, with the Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants going out into the world. It really started way back at the beginning in terms of going into Asia. It was the Church of the East that did that, along the Silk Road, for example. In its early centuries, the Church of the East had to survive the persecutions of the Byzantine Eastern Christian Roman Empire, which deemed it as heretical. The church also had to survive a turbulent existence alongside the shifting Byzantine and Persian border. For some, Zoroastrian Persia offered a refuge, like when the Byzantine Emperor Zeno closed the school of Syriac theology in Edessa, so their most important city, and that was in 489. And then they reopened it in Nisibis, a city in Persia. Others were actually deported to the Sasanian Empire as captives of war, not because they were Christian, but just because they happened to be people living alongside the border and were Byzantines. Yet as part of the Persian church, the Church of the East found a way to thrive and survive. It established its patriarch at the Sasanian capital of Seleucia Ctesiphon, where the patriarchal see was located from the 5th to the 8th century. And then interestingly, after the Arab-Islamic conquest, the patriarch actually followed the Muslim administration, which was the Abbasid Caliphate, to Baghdad. And so the church center operated there until a little bit after the Mongol invasion. So migration allowed the development of this East Syriac theological tradition outside the bounds of Byzantine Christendom under both Zoroastrian and Islamic rule. So as we said, the Mongols took Baghdad in 1258. And soon after that, the patriarch became a refugee in the mountains of southeastern Turkey. So you see the pattern of migration, and as empires come, churches have to move. So the Church of the East, seat of power and its small community, remained there in southeastern Turkey until the 1915 Sayfo. That's the Syriac term for the genocides, which we might know more broadly as the Armenian genocide, because this genocide also targeted Greek and Syriac Christians, including a Church of the East, as well as Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholic, and the Chaldean Catholic Church. So it was in this modern period that this community came to understand itself as ethnically Assyrian. So if you heard of me just talking about the Church of the East, that's because until the 19th century, they didn't actually call themselves Assyrian. So they begin tracing their cultural, linguistic, and territorial roots to the Assyrian Empire. That's the empire in ancient Mesopotamia that lasted until the 7th century BC. So therefore, it was never a Christian empire. And it actually appears in the Old Testament. You all remember references in the Old Testament? It's not like a fantastic empire. It's very strong, it's a conquering military force, and it's understood as an instrument of God's judgment against the kingdoms of Israel and Judah that have turned from God. So that's the ancient sort of lineage that this church chose because of its origins in Mesopotamia. So not since that time, not since the 7th century BC, has there been a geographical territory known as Assyria. And the Church of the East, therefore, has always lived under non-Assyrian political powers in Iraq, in Iran, and in Turkey. So here are the two patriarchs. After World War I, the Church of the East patriarch moved to Cyprus, so that's after the genocides, then to the US. And then in the 1960s, the church split into two branches. So one calls itself the Assyrian Church of the East, one calls itself the Ancient Church of the East, but they all consider themselves to be ethnically Assyrian. So it's a little confusing, but the people that I've talked with generally consider both churches to be part of the same community. So the former, the Assyrian Church of the East, is the larger branch. Its patriarch relocated to Iran until the 1980 Iran-Iraq War. Then it moved to Chicago. So there's a very large, I don't know if anybody's from Chicago, there's a very large Assyrian community in Chicago. And then most recently it moved back to Iraq in 2015. And then the ancient church, the smaller of the two, has been headquartered in Iraq, in Baghdad, since 1968. So, an important part of the historical Middle Eastern Christian migration story can be told by following the movement and relocation of each community's patriarch, of the central sort of, the ecclesial center of each church. So next week, we're going to learn a little bit more about migration and even what these churches look like in the United States today. But we can see that the migration across the Middle East and out of the region altogether have really been part of the lives of Middle Eastern Christians of multiple traditions, really from the beginning, and the role of imperial and other political powers in shaping where people have moved. And as we'll see in our final session next week, migration has been a way for Middle Eastern Christians to physically survive, to keep their church traditions alive, but also to spread their faith to new cultural contexts. And it's interesting to see in the United States, people who are not Middle Eastern becoming part of Middle Eastern churches. So that's something that we can talk about next week. Here are a few recommendations if you want to learn more. The Middle East Council of Churches website just introduces you to who the Middle Eastern churches are. This book by Mitri Raheb, if you want a pretty accessible but deeper overview of Christianity in the modern Middle East. And then if you want to read my book chapter and you didn't, there are still some copies here. So as we close, I'd say I'm happy to answer questions, but I'd also love to hear if there are particular topics for next week that you want, you'd like more information about, because as we looked at these diverse Middle Eastern communities and all the different countries that they live in, we can't talk about all of them in depth. So I'm interested to hear what you would most like to talk about next week, but if there are a couple brief other questions for clarification, happy to answer those as well.
What was the process of the Church of the East's missionary work? How did that, versus modern day missionary work? What is, obviously they're different, but how were they different? What was the process for that?
Yeah, so many of the missionaries were actually merchants. So I mentioned the Silk Road, and so although I think the church, the hierarchy was encouraging people to think of themselves as missionaries, you don't have these sort of fundraising campaigns and a great way to just hop on a plane and go somewhere.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
And so a lot of these people, are established trade routes, and Church of the East, Persian Christians were part of those trade routes, and so some of it was sort of organic, just understanding that you spread the faith wherever you go, and some was, I think, a little bit more intentional. This is a trade opportunity, but also a way to get to India and China.
So they didn't raise money to walk to the Silk Road, that being their job.
Yeah,
it was
so I
kind
think
of
it
a
was
passive thing.
Mm-hmm. You think like in the Bible you hear of like tent makers, like some of the apostles, they also are not always funded, and so you have to have a profession. So I think it was similar there. It wasn't the way that we think about modern missionary organization. Yeah, great question.
Along that line of the trade route and that, in the kingdoms where it would be like an Islamic now kingdom or whatever, and the symbiotic relationship between Sharia law may make it difficult for banking or for things. If you're going to order a set of goods from the other end of the Silk Road, you need, and then like Christians or Jews could do things that the Muslims couldn't hold their money for them and give it back.
Yes.
Was there any of that?
Yeah, that's an important point. I don't know as much about the Eastern, like how all those things worked out, but I know even in the Middle East, Christians often were the go-betweens for commerce between the Middle East and Europe, for example, and it's because they could engage in some of those financial practices that might not be possible for Muslims. So I would imagine it could be similar there, that they could take care of some banking. Banking is not prohibited, but it's the interest, it's the accruing of interest that can be seen as manipulating or taking advantage of people, and so that's why in Islam you can't do that. But then it makes it difficult when you go into a society that has that banking system to be able to trade. So, great question.
More of a general question than sort of almost not even coherent right now. But how is it that so many of the Christian churches today are feeling like the American or Western churches are not supportive of them when they're under a lot of duress or attack? I mean, that's not just it's certainly in Palestine, but it's also been in Lebanon and Syria these last
Yeah, that may be something we can address more next week, but I think, how is it? It's because we're not, right? We're not, many of our churches in the US are not connected to churches in the Middle East. Some of our denominations have certain partnerships, but yeah, so I think it's important to listen to what people on the ground are saying, the connections they would like. And we can talk a little bit more. Also, I would recommend read Dmitry Rahab's book because he traces the recent history of Western Christians saying that they'll support Middle Eastern Christians, but actually using kind of the situation for Middle Eastern Christians for their own political gain in ways that doesn't necessarily benefit the actual Christians. It's a great question. I think we're probably at the end of our time, but I'd be happy for you all to come by and just like say a word or phrase to me if it's something you want to know about next week, or send me an email. And thanks so much for being here today.